Next, let's describe some scatter plots using strength, trend, and shape, and then write a sentence in context using the word tens. Let's start with figure A. Figure A relates the age of various cars to their mileage. So we have age as the explanatory variable and mileage as the response variable. Looking at this, I personally feel like there is quite a bit of scatter in these points, especially when you get into these upper ages. It looks like a small amount of scatter down here, but then it starts being a lot of scatter. So for me, I'm going to call this personally a weak. Oops. So I think it's weak, but I do feel that in general it's still heading uphill. As the age increases, pretty much the miles are increasing, so it seems to be heading mostly up. So I still say positive. And in general, this is in fact a linear trend. It does seem like if I drew a straight line through as many of these points as I could, that would basically summarize it. There's no very clear curve or anything like that happening. So for me, it's still linear. So I'm going to call this a weak, positive, linear trend. And I do think that it has deviations. Points like this and like this, I think, are deviating from the overall trend. That's what's making it also seem so weak. Now, writing my interpretation sentence with the word tend, what I would say is something like, as the age of the car increases, the mileage also tends to increase. Right? It tends to, because for every single car, that's not true. There are some cars that are older that do not, in fact, have more mileage. So I don't want to make a blanket statement saying that this is always true, but in general, it tends to be this way. Okay, let's look at the second example. This is literacy rate and total births per women, and this is literacy rate of certain countries. To me, this is a much stronger trend. The points are much more kind of closely clustered together. I'm going to call this a strong, or at least a stronger than the first one trend. It's a little bit kind of wishy-washy at this time. We're giving kind of our gut feeling, our opinion about it. This one, however, is in the negative direction. And that's a downward trend. But it does also still look linear. There's no noticeable or obvious curve to what's happening, so still linear. And I don't see any deviations from this. I don't see any points that I think are just totally not following this trend. So I'm going to say without deviations. Now my contextual interpretation for this one will be, as the literacy rate increases, so as this X value goes up, that Y value, the total number of births per woman, seems to be moving downward or tends to decrease. Again, because not every single point follows that, but overall, that is the trend. So it tends to do that. Okay, for our last question, I want you to open some data that I've shared with you in an Excel document. It's flight times from Boston. It may have a slightly different title because I'm not finished making this document yet. So it could say something like flight times and something else. But there should be an Excel document shared with you on this page that talks about flight times. And we want to open up the tab that talks about flight times from Boston. So what we've got is we have several cities over here, and how far in thousands of miles they are from Boston, and then how long the flight time then takes you to get there from Boston. In this case, what is the explanatory and response variable? So again, explanatory being X and response being Y. Whenever you're opening up data or using data, X will always be the first variable given, whether it's a left, right, or if it could be a top to bottom orientation. So your X or your explanatory will be what's given first. So in our case, our X or explanatory is distance, and the response is the time. And then our next question says, is the trend positive or negative, and what does that tell that? And is it strong or weak? And are there any deviations? So in order to answer those, we actually need to create this scatter plot. So I'm going to minimize that. And here we have our Module 2 Excel commands. So have those out. Excuse me. We've already got our data in Excel. You want to highlight both the input and the output variables, and it says to be sure your data is oriented correctly. Again, with either the input across the first row or down the first column. So we've got it oriented where this is in and then out, so that's okay. We basically want to just highlight those values. These are our data values, so highlight all of them. Go to Insert. Find the scatter plot area, the one that looks like a scatter plot, and choose the first option, which is just regular scatter. So here's my scatter plot, my plot that just has points on it. And now what I can see to answer some of these questions, this is definitely a positive trend. Make this a little bit smaller, right? It's definitely going in the uphill direction here. Move this stuff around a little bit so I can keep everything nice sizes here. Make this bigger again. So we've definitely got a positive, I will say, trend. And what does that tell us? It tells us as the, remember it's distance as our explanatory. So as the distance increases in general, so does the time, or the time tends to. So as the distance increases, the flight time also tends to increase. And again, I use that word tends. There's a couple points right here where they look like maybe they're almost equal, where one is a little bit farther, but their flight times are basically the same. So we want to use that word tends. Does this appear to be strong or weak? And are there any deviations? Well, this to me is very, very strong. Those points almost lie in a perfectly straight line. And I do not see any points that are deviating, that are way outside of what is being kind of the main trend here. So I'm going to say strong, very strong to me. And I see no deviations. So you really need to be able to, you want to create these scatter plots and get that visual in order to be able to answer some of those questions.